Welcome everyone to the second Expanding Empathy lecture in the Expanding Empathy lecture series through the Rock Ethics Institute. We're hosting this as part of the Moral Agency and Moral Development Initiative in the Rock. We've had a couple of interesting, this is the second event so far, but I'm pleased to welcome Kurt Gray. He's an associate professor in psychology and neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill. Just by way of introduction, Kurt has amassed a variety of really impressive research accomplishments over his career. His work studying mind perception and its relationship to morality is the basis for the talk today. But he studies things ranging from the morality of robots to the fundamental bases of moral cognition to how we understand the minds of others. His fashion study of ghosts. Yeah, all kinds of really interesting topics that bridge across psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy. He's received the Sage Young Scholar Award, the Association for Psychological Science's Rising Star Award, the Theoretical Innovation Prize from the Society for Personality and Social Psychology for his work that we'll talk about today on mind perception and morality. There are too many accolades. Like I have to look at my notes to really do him justice. But he has funding from the NSF, the Templeton Foundation, the Russell Sage Foundation, and probably many more foundations that I'm forgetting. But I had the pleasure at the end of my time in graduate school at UNC, I had the chance to work with Kurt a little bit, and so it's fun to welcome him here and bring him full circle into the Penn State community. So please join me in welcoming Kurt Gray.
All right. It's not a big room, but everyone can hear me? Okay. All right, I'm going to be talking about moral judgment today. I'll be pausing intermittently for questions, but if you have something that you really need to ask, then go for it. I'm ready. All right, so I don't know if you know this, but morality is pretty important. People care a lot about it, so from issues like gay marriage to abortion, right? People feel very deeply about moral issues and act in ways that reflect their moral values. And there is frequently some disagreement about morality. You may know about this. If you've ever tried to convince someone about your view of abortion, for instance, you'll know that it typically doesn't go very well. Immigration, guns, right? There's a whole host of issues that we disagree on very strongly. And so I think it's important to understand how we make our moral judgments to get a handle on issues we care so much about. Turns out morality is also theoretically important because how we understand, how we make moral judgments really reflects our understanding of the mind more generally, right? The very basis of cognition and how we understand how we think and make sense of the world. And so there is a popular theory some of you may be aware of. I think the guy who invented this theory was here recently, right? And the idea is that liberals and conservatives have fundamentally different kinds of moral minds, and that is that liberals have a kind of mind that cares about harm and fairness, right, as one kind of mind, whereas conservatives, they care about harm too, but they have an advantage in morality, right? They have a more moral mind, and that is that conservatives care about harm, but also purity and loyalty and authority, concerns that liberals have no sense of anything, right? We just can't, if you're a liberal, even understand what these words mean because you have a different moral mind, right? And so certainly liberals aren't doing a lot of these things. I don't know what this picture's from, or presages. No, it's like a purity ball. So this is, not to give John Haidt, some kind of props, but certainly it's the case that there's not a lot of liberal purity balls, right? So like the daughter pledges her undying fealty towards her father, who pledges to protect her chastity, right? So there are certainly some differences between liberals and conservatives, but I'm going to argue today, right, that John Haidt's kind of idea that we have these kind of sets of moral foundations or modules in the brain, these switches in the brain is what he calls them in his book, right? Harm and authority and purity, right? These discrete moral foundations. I'm going to argue against that today. I'm going to suggest a new view of the moral mind, and that is that there's no such thing as distinct foundations in the moral mind. Harm is not one switch of many arrayed like light switches in the mind. And in fact, that all morality is ultimately rooted in harm. That's what we'll be discussing today. And so this is called the theory of dyadic morality, and I'll explain why it's called that very shortly. And so the roadmap for the talk is first we're going to go a brief overview of what dyadic morality is. Then we'll talk about the uncontroversial things about the theory, and it turns out there's a lot of this theory that is uncontroversial if you know the kind of broader literature. Then we'll talk about the more controversial things, which are the idea of harmless wrongs, and actually what is harm. Then we'll talk about purity and disgust, everyone's favorite topic, the kind of underlying cognitive mechanisms of morality, and yeah, and then we'll finish up. Okay, so here's a quick outline of the theory. Imagine you're confronted with a typically or potentially immoral act, like someone stealing your credit card, identity theft, something like that. How do you understand if this act, for instance, is wrong? How do you make sense of that act as a moral act? What dyadic morality suggests is that you compare this moral act, or any moral act in fact, any potential act, to a template of two minds. And two minds being a dyad, right? That's where the word comes from. And I've highlighted template here because this word can be vague, and I want to make sure we kind of dig in a bit. So template can mean a kind of schema, a way of organizing the world, a kind of cognitive working model, a prototype. There's lots of different things that you could call this, an exemplar set maybe. I'm not wedded to any particular term here. You could even just say a concept, a working concept, an ad hoc concept. It's just a kind of mental structure that takes information, structures it, and then uses that information to make inferences about the world or judgments. Yeah, so that's all I'm talking about, a kind of template of an act. And so this is a template of two minds, and these minds are a thinking agent and a vulnerable patient. And so if you think about, right, this act right here, or even just like this sense, right, you get the sense of like this guy is being evil and she is being harmed, this kind of like dyad of an act, right, an agent and a patient together. And you can break down this dyadic template into these really three components. An intentional agent, so someone who does the moral act, who has this kind of intention, the causation of damage, and to someone who is vulnerable, a vulnerable patient. And so if you think about the kind of canonically immoral acts that we all kind of agree are immoral, like abuse or murder or assault or rape or fraud or theft and so forth, they all kind of fit this template pretty well. They all involve this structure. And so I would argue that the structure is what I mean when I say harm, right? It is this kind of structure here that I mean when I say harm. And moreover, when I talk about something being dyadic, what I really mean is that it also has this structure. So I talk about harm, and I talk about things being dyadic, and these are kind of the same thing, right? I'm defining harm as having this dyadic structure. And what I'm claiming today is that the more something has this structure, the more something seems dyadic, the more immoral it should seem. And then moral judgments are really proportional to the harm that's salient in a particular act, right, that people perceive, as we'll see. And so you can think about moral judgment as really a continuity, or a continuum of harm, rather. So at one end, you've got things that are kind of not at all immoral, like maybe taking a walk on the beach, right? You've got things that are like maybe a little immoral, like overspending. And then at the top end, you've got things that are very clearly immoral, like murder, genocide, abusing children, right? Those are clearly dyadic. And then in the middle, in the kind of like grayer areas around this penumbra, you've got things that are ambiguously immoral, right? Pornography, prostitution, things that different countries disagree on and we could have debates about, right? And so what I'm suggesting is that morality is this kind of continuum, and it's predicted by a continuum of harm or dyadicness. Right? And the important point to note is that these judgments of immorality are based on how much something seems harmful to someone. It's really this kind of perception of harm that drives our moral judgments. And so this is how people can disagree so strongly in something like gay marriage. Whereas conservatives see gay marriage as causing the destruction of the world, So there's a North Carolinian pastor named Michael Barrett who said that failure to ban gay marriage in North Carolina's constitution would be the equivalent to nuclear holocaust. Right, that seems a little extreme for many liberals, right? But the important point is that he perceived this as happening, right? And that, I argue, underlies his perceptions of harm, underlies his perceptions of immorality. On the flip side, like liberals just see gay marriage as like letting people fall in love and marry the person that they love, right? And so there's very different perceptions of harm, and I argue those underlie perceptions of immorality. And so you may wonder how we share the same moral mind, and this leads to different judgments of morality. And I think the point is that we see different sources of harm. And this is how you can get moral diversity with the same underlying cognitive template of morality. And so recognizing this fact that we all share the same moral mind is important for society, right? And I'm not saying that recognizing that we all have this like deep commonality will let us like sit around a circle and sing Kumbaya. Like, I don't think that's going to solve everything in America today, but I do think it will allow us to have at least a modicum of tolerance and perhaps even some empathy for the other side. We know that we have a kind of common moral template, right? It's like liberals actually don't have a different moral mind than conservatives. We all have the same moral mind, and we just see harm differently. And so how do you get this complexity and diversity, right? You have a complexity and diversity of harm. And so this really requires us to understand harm in a very different way than moral psychology has understood it. So I think starting from 2001, the kind of modern incarnation of moral psychology, I think has gotten harm totally wrong. And I think this is why it's gotten moral psychology wrong as well. And I think if you actually understand what harm is, you understand morality differently, and I think that sets us on a different track than the one that moral psychology has been on for a long time. All right, so that is a quick summary. I'm happy to go into the uncontroversial. I'm also happy to answer a couple questions here, if that's useful, or is that typically what's done?
It's kind of up to you. So if
Okay.
if there's anybody who has any questions, feel free to chime in, just as long as we get back to the rest of the talk.
Okay. Any clarification questions? No? The meat will come later. So, all right, here we go. So let's get to what is uncontroversial about this theory. So first, when you ask people, what is moral judgment, you ask psychologists and philosophers, they say typically you need a norm violation. Dyadic morality agrees, right? You need a norm violation, someone breaking a rule, or even just like a common understanding of behavior. You need that to first initiate this kind of moral judgment. So yep, so far so good. Everyone agrees you need a norm violation. You also need some amount of negative affect, right? So it's not just any norm violation. It's a norm violation to, I don't know, wear a silly hat when you're giving a talk. You would think that's weird. You wouldn't necessarily think that's immoral, right? So it has to be something that like makes you feel really bad. But of course, not all negative affect inducing norm violations are immoral. So if we're in the elevator together, and we're taking it up and the doors close, it's a very packed elevator, I'm standing in the middle, and I just let rip an amazing fart, like one of those like motorcycle farts. Super loud, it's like very smelly, and you all look around, you're like, that's disgusting. True, right? And it is a norm violation to fart inside of a crowded elevator, but I don't go to prison for it. Maybe you don't invite me to parties, you're like, I don't want that kind of guy around. Maybe there's like some social censure, but it's not really immoral in the same sense that child abuse is, right? Child abuse has something extra than farting in an elevator. And so you could think about it, you've got norms and affect, and you need those two things to combine. This is, Sean Nichols has this view, like you need those two things together, but I don't think those two things are enough. You need something else. And so I think that that third ingredient is, not surprisingly, harm. Right? You need the appearance of this dyadic structure to give something moral weight. And in fact, everyone agrees that harm is important when it comes to morality. So there are literally hundreds of studies out there that highlight the importance of each of these elements when making moral judgments. So turns out something that's more intentional is indeed seen as wrong, more wrong, right? So the difference between manslaughter and murder is not controversial. Turns out that causing more damage makes something more wrong. Turns out harming a more vulnerable patient is more wrong than harming a not vulnerable patient. So me kicking a chair is kind of a jerk thing to do. Me kicking a kid in a chair is much worse, right? More damage, more vulnerable, and so forth, right? This is why a CEO punching a little girl in the throat, that seems much more wrong than a little girl punching a CEO in the throat, right? Did I say that directly? Right. Yeah, okay. People are like, no, yeah. They both seem terrible. And that's because, right, the CEO is more of an intentional agent causing more damage to the little girl, right? So the fact that harm is important in moral judgment is kind of not controversial at all. So it's kind of funny that this theory is controversial, but we'll get to that in a bit. And it turns out that every society in the world cares about harm. In fact, there is no society in the world that thinks that harm is always okay. Because if that society was around, it would die out very quickly because people would kill each other, right? A society where like, you know, like the Shakers, the society where like no one had kids, right? No one's part of the Shakers anymore because no one had kids, right? It dies out. And a society where everyone decides to murder each other wouldn't be around for very long. So it's not surprising that harm has universal prohibitions. It turns out that both liberals and conservatives spend most of their moral lives also being concerned about harm. So an experiencing sampling study run by William Hoffman and his colleagues kind of pinged people's phone and asked them, is something related to morality going on right now, or did it happen recently? People say yes. They say, what's that about? People almost always mention something that has a dyadic structure, right? I lied to someone lied to me, someone stole this, right? Someone said unkind words to me. All those things have a dyadic structure, one person harming another. Yeah, so it turns out also if you ask both liberals and conservatives to volunteer in a moral act, they will almost always volunteer something that has a dyadic structure. Again, the most salient, the most important, the most frequent immoral acts are almost always things that fit a dyadic structure. So I think the consensus in the field is really that harm is about 95% of morality. I think we could all agree as like moral psychologists and scientists that harm is almost all of morality. And I think we lose sight of this, actually, for the most part. Like, we're arguing about things, as we'll see, weird things. But it's important to keep in mind that if we're talking about the morality of everyday people, which is probably what psychology tries to do, we should actually think about what everyday people make their judgments about. But there are such things that people believe in that are called harmless wrongs, right? Things that seem wrong, that seem not to involve harm. And this is where things really get exciting. Questions about the uncontroversial? Kind of uncontroversial, but here we go. Yep.
Actually, explain what you mean when you say dyadicness.
Dyadicness?
Yeah.
Yep. Here we go. Yep, dyadic is this definition.
Okay, so it's not just two people. It's the definition of somebody doing intentional damage to somebody else.
Mm-hmm. It's two interacting people. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Two minds interacting in a particular way. It's not just like two minds, you know, talking over coffee. Yeah.
And then when you say it's more dyadic, what are you referring to? The more damage or features of the two people or the whole process?
Any and all, yep. So the example you can talk about, if we talked about like classic cognitive concepts, right? What's a bird? Bird is something that has wings, small, it flies, it eats seeds. What does it mean to be more bird-like? It's more bird-like if it's maybe smaller, if more likely if it eats seeds, if it flies, right? So all those things together combine to make a bird. And so any one of those or in combination makes something more bird-like. Yep. So just like any other concept. Yep. Is someone African? What does it mean to be African American? Right, a particular skin tone, Afrocentric features, culture, right? All those things can combine to make someone seem more African American, as we'll see. So this kind of synthetic definition of a concept in cognition or social cognition, I think, is pretty uncontroversial. Yep.
Quickly, I don't think it matters to your approach, so tell me if it does. But when you use the word moral judgment, it's clear you're meaning moral criticism, right? So moral praise. If I think Mother Teresa is a moral saint, that's not involving a non-violation or negative affect.
Yeah.
It strikes me as a moral judgment, but it's not. But it's not what you're talking about. You're talking about criticism.
Right. So this mostly focuses on the dark side. I'm happy to talk at length about how praise fits into it, but yes, I'm talking about condemnation. Mm-hmm.
Two questions. What I think I heard you say is that we all share the same moral mind.
Mm-hmm.
Is that hardwired? Is that developed?
It's both. Yeah. So I think what is born is the kind of basic psychological elements that underlie moral judgment and judgments in general. So you can imagine that underlying concerns about a vulnerable patient is kind of empathy in general, concern about causation of damage, empathy somewhat, but really understandings of causation, which are pretty innate in kids, and theory of mind is what underlies intentional agents. So those are all fundamental. How they get combined into a moral template is a process of socialization.
And at what age, and I need this information personally, you deal with my kids, but at what age do you feel that the moral mind is fully developed?
Yeah, I think never probably fully developed, but I think, yeah, I have a 2-year-old and she's a sociopath. So I don't know. I'm not a developmental psychologist, but not by 2, is all I know. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Last.
Very quickly.
No, please.
So I'm a bit confused by the Venn diagram of the normal violation, negative effect, and harm is the added one. Isn't negative effect inherently harmful? Like, to me, the idea that there's a negative effect is itself a harm.
Negative affect, sorry.
Right.
That's just feeling bad.
Right, but I think, isn't that like making someone feel bad that's a harm that's been caused to them, that they feel bad?
Yeah, if it's caused, but just in the perceiver. So we're talking about moral condemnation here, right? Like judging something, if you just feel negative affect, it doesn't necessarily mean you're condemning something, right? So.
I mean, that sounds like what needs to be added then is the belief of intent more than just the belief that harm is caused.
Right, exactly, right.
Someone, but I still feel like I've been harmed.
Yeah, so I just want to refer back to the.
In an elevator, I'm still like feeling harmed by that, you know?
Yeah, so right, intention's very important, and that's part of the definition of harm.
Okay.
Yeah. So if I looked at you and I was like, I know you're going to feel sick, I'm going to fart so hard right now, right? That's going to be more immoral than like, oops, I'm sorry, right? Yeah. So again, it's like there's these elements, and the more there's one, the more it seems immoral. But yeah, so that's why there's a synthetic definition of harm.
Okay.
Yeah, it's important. Yeah. Okay. So let's see how much you're kind of steeped in the moral psychology literature. Put up your hand if you have a sibling. Okay. This one's for you. You have a sister?
Yes.
All right. Julian and his sister, it's spring break coming up soon. Julian and his sister, oh yeah, okay. Julian and his sister in spring break decide to go up into the mountains for vacation. They go on a hike. It's a lovely hike. They go back to the cabin they're renting. They open a bottle of wine. They start sharing the bottle of wine. It's so nice. They light a fire. They've always been close. You know, he's Canadian. Canadians have very close siblings. I'm Canadian, but an only child. And they start to think maybe they could take their relationship to the next stage. They start to kiss, and they decide, wouldn't it be wonderful if they made love? Julian wears a condom. His sister's on the pill. They never talk about it to anyone. They never do it again. It's amazing. It's the best thing they ever did. Here's the question. Is this harmless? Put up your hand if this act is harmless, objectively harmless. The moral psychologists typically are like, yeah, that's harmless. Incest. The very special case of incest with Julian's sister. So the majority of moral psychologists, and today, steeped in the tradition that I talked about, like John Haidt, Josh Green, Walton Armstrong, believe that this is harmless. Right? This is a harmless act, and that this is a harmless purity violation. This is what it's called. Right? It's like gross and like you're defying sanctity in the temple of the body. And so there's been this kind of like cottage industry in moral psychology about harmless purity violations, right? So how can these things be wrong if they're harmless? Doesn't argue against my theory in a large sense. But I'm going to suggest today, I'm going to be crazy today. I'm going to suggest that maybe fucking your sister, right, isn't as harmless as social psychologists might think that is. I know, I'm a firebrand. And so this is important. It's important because, look, if this act is harmless, if it's actually harmless, then how you get a moral judgment is you can't have a template of harm, right? You need something else. You need this switch, this purity switch to get like sister fucking to be immoral. But if it is at least a little bit harmful, or at least as seen as harmful, right? Because it's about perceptions. If it seems harmful, then you don't need a separate switch. You don't need a separate switch to get this to be seen as immoral. You can get it for free with a template of harm, right? There's like harm somewhere in the middle of like having sex with your sister, and that level of harm predicts the level of immorality, right? So you don't even need a switch. And so if that's true, right, if it's still perceived as harmful, then we don't have to have, we can kind of reevaluate the last 15 years of moral psychology. So let's see, is it harmless? Well, that gets to the question of what exactly do we mean by harm? And so harm is typically understood as having three properties, at least in traditional modern moral psychology. One, harm is objective and reasoned, and this comes from the roots in the trolley problem, right? If someone gets crushed to death on the tracks, they're objectively harmed. There's blood and tendons everywhere. It's tied to reason because we think more. We're more likely to like care about less harm, utilitarianism. And harm is binary. There's a switch. It's harmless or it's not, right? Harmless or not. However, I'm going to suggest that all of these assumptions are wrong, and that harm is in fact an intuitive, perceived continuum. If you understand harm in this sense, then you don't need moral foundations. And so let's talk about something being objectively harmless. Like we say like having sex with your sister is objectively harmless. What do we think? Is this objectively immoral? Anyone think that this is objectively immoral? Or objectively not immoral? All right, people get kind of skittish about saying that something's objectively immoral. Why? Because anthropology. Because it turns out that morality varies across cultures. So there is a caste of Brahmin Indians that Rick Schwader went to go hang out with. And Rick Schwader's the kind of anthropologist, John Haidt's advisor. And he was embedded with these folks, and he found that they think that it is immoral for the eldest son of a family to eat chicken after his father's funeral. That's the scenario, right? It is wrong to eat chicken. They're like, wow, moral pluralism, right? They must have very different moral senses than us, because this is an act that seems objectively harmless and yet is moralized. So we can't say that something is objectively immoral. But we are trying to say it's objectively harmless. However, if we're going to be anthropologists, let's do it all the way. Let's not like be half anthropologists. Let's consider the full cultural assumptions of the particular culture. Here they are. This sect of Brahmin Indians believe the following. Once a father dies, his son is tasked with processing his father's death pollution. What this means is that he eats a vegetarian diet for about a month, doesn't cut his hair, doesn't cut his nails. While doing this, the idea goes, is that the death pollution from his father goes through his body, his spirit in some sense, into the kind of like fingernails and his hair. He doesn't eat chicken because eating hot food would disrupt this process, and by disrupting this process would basically condemn his father's soul to eternal suffering. So, let's now take the full scope and think, eating chicken causes eternal suffering for his father. I'd like to argue that this act now is not objectively harmless. It is in fact harmful, and it's harmful to people in that culture. And in fact, it is immoral, I would argue, because it is seen as harmful. And in fact, many studies done by Schwader and Haidt find that there's a very strong correlation between perceptions of harm in a culture and perceptions of immorality. In fact, they're almost perfectly aligned. And so I'm going to argue today that it's important to be moral pluralists, but it's also important to be pluralists in general, that if you're going to be concerned about differences across cultures in terms of perceptions of immorality, it's also important to take into account perceptions of harm, especially because they're so closely aligned. And so this gets to a broader point in our field, that there's kind of this researcher egocentrism. Many times researchers are confusing their own opinions and own perceptions with those of our participants. So this happens with liberals and conservatives. It happens with Brahmin Indians. And I think in terms of liberal conservatives, I think when liberals characterize conservative morality as being not about harm, turns out if you actually talk to conservatives, conservative Christians in particular, they will tell you that things are wrong because they are harmful. God forbids them because God wants to protect us from harm. And it turns out that participants actually don't agree with researchers about cases that researchers think are objectively harmless. So let's go back to Julian and his sister. Right? You may think that this is objectively harmless as a moral psychology researcher, but if you ask participants themselves, you take a typical person off the street and be like, hey, here's a scenario. Do you think it's harmless? They say, no, I think it's pretty wrong. And I think it's pretty harmful. And it turns out you need like 15 minutes of solid arguing with someone to finally get them to be like, fine, I'll give up. Fine, it's harmless. And their first reaction is, in fact, that it is very harmful. And so you might think, well, maybe it's just post hoc rationalization, right? There's this like purity mechanism that makes you see it as wrong, and then you like gloss on the top with harm. That's one potential explanation. Let's test it, right? Is harm reasoned or is it intuitive? So an easy way of testing this is giving people moral transgressions that vary on the amount of harm that they involve. So what we did is we gave people transgressions that were physically harmful, like beating a cat. They were not at all immoral, like taking the bus. And the interesting things in the middle were like, having sex with their sibling. Funny kind of backstory of moral psychology, right? There's lots of weird things, like having a kitten rub itself on your genitals. Like John Haidt is a master at coming up with these. I'm kind of in awe of his ability to come up with these. So like rubbing a kitten on your genitals. And then we came up with our own scenarios. Actually, we used his scenarios, and he was like, those scenarios are too dyadic, right? Like clearly, letting a kitten rub itself on your genitals is like too much harm. Like there's an agent, and the kitten's the patient. So we had to come up with our own, which was like, I'm not proud of these, but like masturbating to a picture of your dead sibling, right? You're like, okay, like that, it's weird, and finally reviewers agreed, like reviewers pushed us to do this, like science, you made us do this, right? We didn't want to, but we did in the end. And so those are the kind of harmless impurity scenarios. And so if you let people answer those moral scenarios in terms of whether they are harmful and whether they have victims, and you give people lots of time, it turns out that you get these data, right? So the harmful ones, clearly harmful. The ones that are not immoral or not harmful at all, taking the bus, clearly not harmful. Impurity scenarios are seen to have some amount of harm, right? Already there's like this continuum here, right? They're seen as a little bit harmful, but folks who advocate moral foundations theory would be like, well, this is just post hoc justification. What happens when you don't give people time to reason? What happens if you put people under time pressure and get them to answer as quickly as possible? Turns out you don't change these other judgments. What happens to the middle judgments? It turns out they go up. So it turns out that having time to reason actually suppresses perceptions of harm. And if you get people to answer quickly, they actually perceive a fair amount of harm, consistent with dyadic morality. We did another study where we did a more implicit measure. We got people to answer how much suffering do you think this kid is feeling, like how sad is this kid, how much pain is this kid feeling. And it turns out that people think the kid is feeling much more sad if you do things like this. Right? So when you're confronted with an immoral act, even that's objectively victimless, right, you can't help but kind of automatically perceive a victim. You can't help see this kid as being sadder. And so the example I like to use is fear of flying. So if you are afraid of flying, right, you're on the plane, it's taking off, you're sweating, you're panting, you're like, oh my God, I'm terrified. And then you're up in the air and someone says, like, why are you so scared? And you say, well, it just feels so dangerous. You're in this like little tube so far above the earth and we could die at any moment, fall out of the sky, right? There's plane crashes all the time. And they say, actually, no. Turns out that flying is actually safer than driving. And so now that you rationally know that flying is very safe, you can't be afraid of flying because of your perceived danger. There must be some other reason why you're afraid of flying. There must be some separate switch that causes a fear of flying that's not the fact that it feels dangerous, right? But in fact, you still perceive it as danger, right? There's this innate feeling that you are in a tin can in the sky, and that makes you think that it's harmful, and that harm, perceived harm, makes you think that is right. That's why you're afraid of flying. right? And so I think the same thing is true with acts that are perceived to be harmless wrongs, right? You still have this intuitive sense that it's harmful, and that drives your moral judgment. And so it's this persistent intuitive harm that drives your moral judgment. And the final point I'll make about the nature of harm is that harm is actually a continuum and that it is not binary. So when we talk about things that are harmless but wrong, it really collapses continua, right? It turns a kind of continuum into a dichotomy. And if you've ever taught or taken research methods, you know that that's in general a no-no, right? You don't take a continuous measure and just break it into two for rhetorical value. And I think the same thing is true here. Morality is not binary, so we have a continuum of immorality, right? Sibling sex is probably bad, but it's probably not as bad as killing your sibling, and certainly it's worse than littering. Likewise, harm is not binary, right? Having sex with your sibling may cause kind of harm to relationships, and your sister and perhaps you as well, but it's not as harmful as killing your sister. And the fact that I use the same figure here for harm and immorality is no coincidence, and that is that I'm arguing that acts are immoral to the extent that they're intuitively perceived to be harmful. And this definition captures all the elements, right? Intuitions, perceptions, and a continuum. And so you can actually test this with things like reaction time studies. So in this study, we asked people to respond as quickly as possible to whether an act was immoral, whether it was harmful, and as a negative control, whether it was unpleasant. And I want to highlight this, and I think this is why this study is very nice, because there's basically no studies in moral psychology that ever control for just badness. When they say like something's wrong, they often don't even say morally wrong. They just say like, is this wrong? Well, it's like wrong to put ketchup on pancakes, right? But does someone deserve to go to jail for that? That's when you have to ask about moral wrongs, and it even helps to control for just general negativity. And so in this study, we actually controlled for general negativity, and what we'd predict from a dyadic morality standpoint is that the more quickly people rate its harm, the more quickly people should rate its immorality. In fact, maybe people should see harm a little bit faster than immorality. And in fact, that's what we find. So you find a pretty amazing correlation between reaction times of harm and immorality. And this works if you take out the kind of like canonically harmful things. It works if you take out the ones at the top. Basically, I don't want to say bulletproof because you're not allowed to say that as a scientist, but it's a pretty robust finding. It turns out that it's true across politics, so it's not just like some liberal thing. It's conservatives and liberals see the same thing. And in fact, the R squared for conservatives is a little higher. And I should say that all these studies were run because we got reviewers on these papers from John Hyde and other folks who are linked to moral foundation theory. So as an example of kind of like this kind of adversarial, I wouldn't say it's collaboration, it's just straight up adversaries making the science better, right? So every time they had a kind of concern, we kind of ran an additional study, and we're pleased to find that the data were still consistent with our claims. And of course, I would never argue that there's not different values that people care about, right? Even as someone who leans liberal, right, I understand that loyalty is important. Right? If a grad student told me that they're going with their title instead of my title, I would be annoyed. Authority, purity, fairness, like these are all things that people care about. And we don't even need to stop there, right? Community, autonomy, and divinity, these are Schwader's kind of ethics. Industriousness, social order, social justice, Ronnie Jenoff Bullman. Self-restraint, benevolence, conformity, if you're a fan of Schwartz. Tradition, universalism, patriotism, family. Chastity, temperance, justice, faith, charity. Or if you want to go to like the big seven from back in the Bible, right? You could probably find 100 different values that people care a lot about. Why stop at 5? Right? There are so many values in the world that people care a lot about. And I think that appreciating the rich diversity in values is important. But each of these are not equally moralized. So the question is, what takes a value from simply a word that people understand the definition of to something that people care about? And I think the answer is, not surprisingly, harm. That the more something is intuitively tied to harm, the more people see it as immoral. And so the more you think it's harmful to have sex with your sister, the more you think that is immoral. And so the example I like to use here is punctuality. All right, so my wife and I, all right, I'll just do punctuality and then, okay. My wife and I disagree about punctuality. I think the time to leave for a party is when the party is scheduled to start, right? If the party starts at 8, you leave at 8, and maybe 8:15, right? If you show up half an hour early, that's terrible. If you show up half an hour late, that's great. My wife thinks you should be at the party when it starts. And so we have this disagreement, right? And we know we disagree about it, but it's not really, it doesn't lead to blows. But where we both agree about the importance of punctuality is handing in like our daughter's healthcare forms or submitting her passport application, right? Like, because that's when it matters, and we didn't do it on time, it would be harmful to her future. And so in that case, right, we take a value and we transform it into a moral value when it's tied to harm.
Yeah, what I'm thinking is that if the sibling sex scenario, I think it's a little innocent, but I think it's the result of incest that you can have a baby. You did say that you
Mhm. That's right, yep.
Okay, but I think why people think it's morally wrong is because the result of incest, pregnancy leads to this.
Mhm.
And I think that's a different measurement of whether something's harmless.
Right, yeah, so the question was, is it just that these perceptions of harm are driven by the fact that incest might result in a deformed baby? And I think that's absolutely true, and I think it's a great demonstration of the fact that you just can't shake it, right? Because in this scenario, they tell people, like, you won't have a kid, everyone's wearing protection, like, it just won't happen. And yet, right, just like the flying example, like, you just can't shake it. And so I think that's true in a lot of cases, right? You just can't shake the feelings of harm. Yeah.
Well, my thought with that, related to that, is like we naturally go to heuristics, right? And so you're giving time for people to think that perhaps they're going to be able to specify to the scenario you're given. But instinctually, my thought is if I had sex with my sisters, it would be immoral. And so even though this one doesn't sound immoral to me, I automatically connect to what I know and what
Right.
would be wrong for me.
Right.
And therefore, it's hard to separate and think about, like, you know, this would affect my relationship and this, and this. They're both married, you know, that's gonna cause trouble, you know. It would affect our relationship, obviously.
Mhm.
And so I feel like the idea that it's because they're instinctively connecting it to the idea of incest or that there would be a bad thing that's statistically happening they can't shake it is, I just feel like that's a way we're oversimplifying it to. And I think a bigger problem is people don't deal well with hypotheticals. People don't
Yeah.
look at the trolley problem and go, yeah, you could push one person in front and stop a train. They're like, that's
Yeah.
not what real life is.
Right. So I think the broader problem with moral psychology is, yes, there are these hypotheticals, but I think the reason that we're bad at them is because we have these gut reactions. We just don't believe that they're harmless. And so I think that's true of trolleys. I think that's true of this. I think in general, and you're going to love the next scenarios, actually. One more, and then we'll go on.
So as usual, sort of a two-prong question there.
Okay, one prong.
One prong, all right.
Okay.
So harm assessed by who to what end? So what are the relations between the people? And so they're getting a lot of joy and satisfaction out of this. So does that assuage the harm or no? And who cares?
Right. So I think it is harm is in the eye of the beholder, like minds, like beauty. And so I think if you are an outside observer, viewing two people having sex, or you thinking of your sister and having sex with her, then, I mean, I think, yeah, the question is a definitional question, and I think I'm going to just skirt the definition and say it's a matter of perception. Yeah, and we can talk later. This is a deeper question. Okay, so I think based on these examples, you don't need a special purity mechanism. You can have something be wrong on the basis of harm and a redefined harm. So harm is really this active ingredient that transforms values into moral values. And so the biggest area of controversy about this theory has gone into purity and disgust. And so there's been some work that suggests that when people make judgments of purity, like sister sex, there's a different kind of like cognitive processes that people use. So one example that people use is having sex with a dead chicken and then eating it, right? So you go home, it's cold here with the snow, you're a little lonely because winter's dark, you buy a chicken at the grocery store, you take it home, you have sex with it, and then you cook it and eat it. Is a scenario that lots of people use, and it seems like people make different judgments in this scenario than some other judgments, like poisoning someone. And there's some research that shows that maybe these have different mechanisms. But I'm just going to suggest today that maybe these aren't the same thing. Because guess what? Having sex with a chicken is pretty fucking weird, right? It's like you read a lot about poisoning, right? Russian spies are poisoned all the time. It happened in antiquity all the time. You never read a newspaper article about chicken masturbation. At least I haven't. And so it turns out that chicken masturbation is actually really weird, and being weird is counternormative. And it turns out that norms are a part of moral judgment, right? And so the fact that you're having these super weird things changes our moral judgments in ways that are not surprising. And in fact, you don't need a kind of different moral template for purity. You just need to recognize the fact that these things are weird. And in terms of understanding moral judgment, if you make scenarios that reflect the purity domain, like things about sex, like prostitution and pornography, that are more everyday scenarios. So you actually get people to volunteer these scenarios, and you make scenarios based off of them, as we did. It turns out these differences between purity and harm disappear. So what really drives these differences are weirdness and not purity per se. And it's important to recognize how frequent these weird scenarios are. So we did a kind of MIDI meta-analysis on this stuff, and it turns out that there are 4,351 citations at the time of publishing this that have cited these really weird scenarios. So you think of like the corpus of moral psychology, right? 95% of morality is based on harm in everyday life, but 95% of moral psychology is basically based off chicken fucking. Now, I think this is problematic. Let's imagine we wanted to have a theory of mammals. We need to think of the right kind of mammal to make a theory on, right? So there's lots of mammals that we can make our theory of mammals on, but we want a really good one that's really going to capture the essence of being a mammal. And I've got one, the platypus. Right, it's got a beak, it has poison glands, it lives underwater, like lays eggs, it has like little leather flaps on its hands, and you're like, that is a really interesting mammal. It is interesting, but it's a really bad mammal in a kind of cognitive definition of what a mammal is. All these constructs are created, right? So there's no such thing as like species in the world. These are all cognitive constructions. And I think as cognitive constructions go, mammals is not a bad one, but a platypus is a very bad mammal, right? It doesn't fit the category very well. And so if we're making a theory of morality based on the weirdest and most bizarre cases, I'm not sure that theory is very useful for understanding everyday morality. It turns out that purity is also a pretty bad construct in terms of psychological constructs. So for a foundation to exist, right, it must be in some sense separate from other foundations. There must be some like basic construct validity. And to we evaluate construct validity, we evaluate something called discriminant validity. If you don't know methods, you're like a freshman, then here's a crash course, right? A construct has to be different from a construct to say it is something different, right? If I say I have this amazing new construct, it's called a Zorg. You're all sitting in these Zorgs. You can see a Zorg right here. You're like, isn't that just a chair? And I say, no, it's a Zorg. You're like, what's the difference? I say, well, there's no difference. But it's still a Zorg, not a chair. You're like, well, he's actually talking about a chair. And so the question is purity basically a Zorg as to a chair, right? Is there anything different for purity than other constructs that we already know? Well, let's test it. What's the correlation between purity and harm? It turns out the correlation between purity and perceived harm is pretty high. It's about 0.9. So ratings of impurity and ratings of harm, pretty high. Purity and authority, a kind of another example, pretty high. Purity and conservatism, pretty high. Purity and religiosity, a little lower. Purity and weirdness, pretty high. Now here's another fun methods trick. It turns out that the maximum correlation between any two constructs is limited by the internal reliability of that construct. This maybe sounds complicated, but basically two things can't correlate perfectly with each other if the internal consistency of those constructs is bad. If I have a really bad tape measure and a really bad scale, a correlation between height and weight is never going to be that high because the measuring tools have a lot of randomness. It turns out that the measurement tools that people use to assess moral foundations like purity is not very good. The internal reliability of these things is pretty low. Test-retest reliability is about like 0.6, right? Which is actually lower, I should say, than these correlations. So what happens if you correct for this? What's the kind of latent correlation between these two things? I see some testing, like some typing there to go check this out. It turns out that if you correct for attenuation, now the latent correlation is pretty high. And if you this is your first exposure to correlation coefficients. This is technically as high as they get, right? So it turns out that purity is not distinct from these other concepts, which further argues against the idea that there's a separate purity module in the mind or the brain. In fact, the purity is not even a reasonable concept in psychological terms. What about disgust? Well, one of the genesises for moral foundations theory is the idea that disgust drives moral condemnation of purity violations, which is later cloaked in harm-based rationalizations. And the idea is like disgust, you're like, ugh, and then you see something that's immoral, and then you're like, well, it's probably harmful, right? That's the idea. Of course, Dyadic morality suggests that perceptions of disgust maybe lead to perceptions of harm, or feelings of disgust lead to perceptions of harm, and it's those perceptions of harm that really drive moral judgment. And so we tested this in a paper. We gave people in one study a variety of moral scenarios. We asked them to rate their disgustingness, their immorality, and how much harm they involve. And it turns out that what we found was a mediation pathway consistent with dyadic morality. That the more you think it's disgusting, that's a cue to it being harmful, and then that's a cue to it being immoral. And it turns out we didn't even really need to run this study. Because if you really think about it, this has to be true. And so I mentioned I have a 2-year-old, right? She's in diapers. Diapers are gross. There's a lot of poop all the time. When she was littler, right, she would like poop on the walls, I'd poop on my hands. There's a lot of poop. Poop is disgusting. Right, another new revelation, poop's super gross, except to a 2-year-old, arguing against the innateness of purity, I should say. But except to a 2-year-old, right, poop is super gross. Now I tell people, look, I cleaned up all this poop. I was covered in poop. Poop was everywhere. People are pretty gross, but they're not like, you monster. You should go to jail and burn, right? Clearly it's disgusting, but it's not immoral. Why not? Because it's not harmful. In fact, I'm helping my daughter by cleaning up her poop. So already we can see that the subset of disgusting acts involve things that are both harmful and not harmful, and it is only those harmful things that people rate as immoral. And so purity is not distinct, and disgust does not drive moral judgments. And so I'm going to finish up, I guess I have a few minutes, with this idea that morality is special like people are special, which is to say it's not really special, but it kind of is. Let me explain how that works. So as a person, like each of you are special in your own way. Your mom loves you in particular. You have your own special like constellation of memories and personality and experiences that make you you, right? But it turns out that all of us have personalities and memories and experiences, right, that combine in some way to make us special. So we're special in the same way, and we have all sort of a combination of these ingredients. Just like morality is special, but it's not different. Let me get to that. So imagine morality is really like a categorization judgment, just like any other social categorization judgment. So if you're thinking whether something's wrong or not, you kind of compare it to two things. If you want to know about another categorization judgment, like whether something's a bird, or maybe whether someone is African American or not, right? Those are all categorization judgments. And so if you want to know whether something's a bird, what do you do? And this is like very boring cognitive psychology, Eleanor Roche from the 1970s. Right, what you do is you take an example of a bird or not a bird, and you compare it to all the birds you know from what you've seen in the wild and what you've learned explicitly and what you've seen on movies, and you compare it to that kind of template or working model or prototype. And then you make a continuum of birds, right? So this comparison gets you like robins, great birds, right? Very matching to your concept of birds. Guinea pigs, not birds. They don't look like your template. And penguins, shitty birds, right? They're still technically birds. We would still say they're bird, but they're just not very good birds because they don't meet the template very well. So it's not like the existence of penguins makes us go, oh my God, we have to abandon the idea of birds because one bird doesn't fit into it very well. Right? We're still like, yeah, birds is a human construction. Some things fit into it better than others. African Americans as well, right? You want to know whether someone is African American, what you do is you have a kind of cognitive working model that you construct from all your interactions with African American folks. Does anyone know what this cognitive working model is called? A template about race. Very difficult. It's called a stereotype, right? It's like very controversial, not at all, right? People use cognitive working structures to make sense of the world. You have all your kind of elements that you understand African Americans. You have a stereotype. You compare people to stereotype, and then you get a continuum. So one end, you've got a guy in lederhosen, this white guy, not black, right? Super white dude. Here, Samuel L. Jackson, yes, he is black, right? He has all the features you would associate with African American. Obama, maybe, right? He identifies as African American, but he's certainly less African American than Samuel Jackson. But again, the existence of Obama, right? He's like high SES, he's powerful, doesn't invalidate the kind of stereotype that people use to make judgments. And so the same thing is true with morality. If you want to know whether someone's immoral or something, an act is immoral, you take a template, a cognitive working model, even a stereotype, if you want to call it, of immorality, built up out of various immoral acts that you maybe have seen or been explicitly taught, and you construct a continuum, this continuum. And so, in some sense, the point of the talk circles around to be almost very boring, and that is that we make our moral judgments just like any other social categorization judgments. We have a template, we compare an act to the template, and the better the match, the more robust the judgment. And so this idea is parsimonious, which is nice in science. It helps us predict whether something's going to seem immoral, because all you have to know is whether someone sees it as harmful based on their assumptions about the world and so forth. It also allows for pluralism, because people can differ in how they see harm in the world. If you think that white men are vulnerable to threat because of changing economic climates, then you think that policies that harm white men are immoral, right? And if you don't think that Syrian refugees are vulnerable to harm, then you don't think that immigration policies that stop asylum are immoral. And it turns out, in every case that we've studied, those perceptions of harm about those specific cases predict whether people think that they're immoral. And so we've discussed a lot about what moral judgment is. Of course, moral judgment varies between people, but I don't think you need a moral foundation or a set of switches in the brain of all animals to account for this. Right? You can get it for free with one template, a dyadic template. And of course, there are many values, and there are many values that differ between people, but those are all moralized to the extent to which they're intuitively bound to perceptions of harm. And so I think it's good that we recognize that we all share the same moral mind, because this can help us understand moral disagreement and perhaps make us a little nicer. So my grad student and I, Chelsea Shine, who helped develop this theory, we wrote an op-ed in the New York Times called The Myth of the Harmless Wrong. And we talk about gay marriage, and we talk about Michael Barrett, who mentioned that failure to ban gay marriage would be the equivalent of a nuclear holocaust. And what we argue is that Michael Barrett was not just making this up to piss off liberals. Right? He was not just using hyperbole. He legitimately saw terrible things happening from gay marriage, like the dissolution of the American family would ultimately undermine everything that conservatives held dear, especially religious conservatives, right? And so the point of this article was saying, like, look, these perceptions of harm are legitimate. You may disagree with them, but it doesn't mean that they are not real to people who hold them. And recognizing that fact, that these perceptions of harm are real to those who hold them. They're real to the Brahmin Indians who worry about death pollution, right? They're real to liberals who care about the things that liberals care about, and conservatives who care about the things conservatives care about. And recognizing that fact can make people a little nicer. And in fact, after publishing the article, we got a lot of emails from conservatives, and none of them were angry. They said, thank you for recognizing our position, right? We're conservatives. We're Christians. And the reason that we care about these things is not just because we think because God said it so, and like we just have this rule that anything that God says we believe in, but God said it so because he's protecting us from harm. So the reason we think these things is because we're concerned with harm to our souls and to America. And so there's clearly a moral chasm today in America, and it's clearly difficult to see eye to eye. But my hope is that by recognizing that we all share a same mind based on a common template of harm, we can help bridge this divide at least a little bit. And that's it. Thanks very much. Please.
I'm wondering, in your definition, if there are any qualifications to the vulnerable patient? Because I think a lot of times when something's more vulnerable, like an animal is more vulnerable than a human in many times, yet we don't see increased harm when we kill animals versus when we kill humans.
Mm-hmm. Do I still need to do the question?
Yeah, if you just like re-summarize the question.
So the question is, are there differences in perceptions of vulnerability? How can we kill an animal who people will admit is more vulnerable to humans and not feel bad about it? And so the answer is some people do feel really bad about it. And if you hang out with vegans, right, they will tell you that you are a monster for eating a defenseless animal. And that like it'd probably be better to eat another human, at least another carnivore, right? Because carnivores don't feel pain like a defenseless animal does. So the shorter answer is that perceptions of harm do track people's moral judgments, but they're kind of reciprocal. So if you are a meat eater and you eat animals every day, then you feel like kind of a jerk eating defenseless animals, right? And so you change your perceptions of their mind. You think that they're not vulnerable. So I know in a rational sense that pigs are actually very smart. In an intuitive sense, I don't get that intuition at all because I eat pigs every day. I live in North Carolina, right? North Carolina barbecue is everywhere. And so I think that perceptions of harm line up very closely with perceptions of moral judgment. And when we get a shift in one, we shift the other. Yeah, that's a good question. Please.
I have been thinking if you can generalize your moral judgment to like non-human objects, because I have read several of your papers about mind perception, and I wonder if beyond those three components of this moral judgment, the dyadic model of dyadic morality theory, if there is any like dimensions of in terms of mind perception, like the experience dimension and the agent dimension.
So the question is, can you perceive harm in inanimate objects and mind?
Alexa, and or if people always say you can't, that some unacceptable sexual behavior is okay with sex robots. And I wonder why people have different standards in terms of human versus non-human objects, and how you can use like mind perception to explain.
I always enjoy talking about sex robots. So the question was, right, why do some people think that doing terrible things to sex robots like Westworld is not so bad, and why do some people think it's bad? So I think mind perception is an important element there. I think when people do perceive those acts as immoral, they do perceive minds in robots, especially intuitively. So there's a study by Christopher Bartnick, and he asked people to turn off robots. So there's a lifelike robot. She is sitting there, and he says, just go turn her off. Okay. So the participant walks over to the robot, and as the participant gets close, the robot says, please don't kill me. Please don't kill me. And then the experimenter's like, it's just a robot. Come on, it's just a robot. No big deal. It's like, no, please don't kill me. And so there you can be like intuitively like, no, I know it doesn't have a mind. But there's cues there that kind of intuitively, innately trigger your mind perception. And so I think, again, to the extent to which you perceive a mind, you think it's immoral. And if you perceive it as immoral, then you feel like feedback and perceive a mind. People also make the argument that if you are doing those kind of terrible things with robots, then you might do those things with people too. And so they see a pretty direct line from, think of the kind of people you'd be, right? If you were think of what you would become if you did terrible things to robots, right? You wouldn't want them babysitting your kid. You're like, what do you do in your spare time? I like raping robots, but otherwise I'm a great guy. Here are my references. I want to babysit your child. You'd be like, no, thank you, right? Because it suggests a kind of broader propensity to harm. Yep.
I guess you think like semi-ovum experiments.
Mm-hmm.
Well, why can't we export that to animals? Because there's a mind there, and so why wouldn't that work? We don't have to assume a mind, just a mind not like a person, I suppose. So
Export.
the idea that export the robot thing to animals instead. So if I'm willing to let animals be cattle prodded so that I can eat them, right? I acknowledge there's a mind there, so why is that not the same harm? Why is that acceptable? Where's the dissonance?
I think the question is, why do people, if people can be upset by harming robots, why aren't they harmed by eating animals? Again, I think some people are really upset by harming animals. I think when it comes to eating animals, there's a variety of factors. One, it's normative, right? And so many normative things we just kind of turn a blind eye to. It doesn't even like enter the realm of morality, right? Because it's not counter-normative. So it like initially. Two, I think people do get upset when you harm animals. So if like before I eat an animal, what I do is I slowly cut out its eyes with a mechanical pencil, right? And just like the shrieks of agony to make me so hungry, right? You'd be like, you're a monster. And so we do care about animal suffering, but we just try not to think about it.
So that's sort of, so one of the three parts you have there is about negative affect.
Mm-hmm.
So that's actually,
Right,
that's
yeah.
sort of where the core of my question is.
Mm-hmm.
Why is there a disconnect there in that case? Why is that not perceived as a harm, i.e., why do we need to have it? Why are we able to get in there? If we acknowledge there's a harm and we acknowledge that there is a negative affect, to an extreme especially, is it just that it's not present? Is that the important element? Is there some kind of distancing, some like potency issue here?
How can we eat animals? I think it's just dissonance. They're delicious, right? I mean, how do you, drink a straw? There's a huge trash gyre in the Pacific Ocean, and like sea turtles are getting up their nose and dying. Like, you're a terrible monster.
I'm vegan. I have equilibrium now. So
Right, but right, yeah, right, there you go. So that's how we do things, right? The fact that you can have a straw and yet, right, claim to care about animals. The human mind is an amazing justification system. I don't use straws, that's why I eat pigs. Right? Yeah.
So, okay, first, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
It's very interesting, and just from the beginning, I agree. The dyadic aspect of morality is fundamental, and even like, so I'm a sociologist, so even looking sociologically, harm is there's widespread agreement that bodily harm is wrong. There's widespread disagreement about things like civil liberties.
Mm-hmm.
So that, I think that kind of reinforces. I'm wondering kind of like what's the next step? Because even like in his question about, well, how can we, if we perceive that animals are harmed, we still eat them, but we perceive that robots are harmed and we don't hurt them. However it goes, the role of society and the social construction of norms, reinforcement of those norms,
Mm-hmm.
from a sociological perspective, that's what's so helpful about the foundations, the moral foundations. Not necessarily that they are foundations, but that they are descriptive pieces of moral intuitions. So I'm just wondering, like, this takes a step back and says this underlies all the foundations, but what's the next step for trying to describe not just their commonality, but maybe where the variation comes from?
Right, so the question is, what's next?
Yeah.
And MFT is useful because it provides a taxonomy. I agree, taxonomies are very important. And the next step is to provide a taxonomy of harm that explains everything that moral foundation does, but better. In process right now. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we have developing, and people love scales because, we all want scales in our research and we like predicting things. And so currently developing a scale that, that predicts political differences in moral judgment pretty well. Yeah.
Yeah, we can, related to that, like, I will admit, I like the moral foundations as well as a sociologist, but I also agree with you, like, we're measuring them badly, but I feel like what you're really criticizing isn't the actual foundations, but rather the operationalizing of them. So, like, when you're
I'm
talking about
doing
the
both.
purity foundation and how you retest and it's a whole different number, that's not a problem with the concept of purity, that's a problem with how we're measuring purity, which is that we use the moral foundations questionnaire, and we like, kind of came out of the 90s and everyone's like, sure, and then we did no more work on it since then.
So that, yeah.
I just feel like I don't think it's necessarily antagonistic, your theory and the moral foundations. Like you mentioned, I feel like they very much work together. And I don't feel like Haidt would deny that harm underlies all of the foundations.
He would.
He
did.
To be fair, Haidt is very,
He has.
he likes to argue. But,
Yeah.
okay, I don't think a lot of people who believe the moral foundations would necessarily deny that.
Yeah, so the question is it just a disagreement about how the foundations are measured or a disagreement about the essence of the foundations? And I think the disagreement is, in fact, a deep disagreement about the nature of the foundations and the mind more generally. So I think the backstory is that John and his collaborators come from a modular view of the mind by which evolution structured the mind as kind of like little Lego pieces, right? There's all these modules that you add, massive modularity. And so that idea of the mind is like consisting of these like modules that are encapsulated inputs and outputs that are kind of like given by evolution and innate and unable to be really changed, although you could activate it more or less. I think that view of the mind is wrong. Daryl and I have done some work on it. I think John has taken a step back from that very extreme view to a view of moral foundations that is unfalsifiable, frankly, right? To say that it's a first draft of the moral mind, and all we're trying to do is describe the moral world and provide a taxonomy that's nevertheless grounded in kind of like development and culture and intuition, I think is a lot of big words that we all agree in that provides no scientific value. So I think what moral foundations theory does is it gives people an easy, if not very good scale that they can put in their research. And I think it gives people a set of language that we can kind of like glom onto. And I think that language is very useful. And I think it's very powerful. And I think that language gives us the illusion of explanation. And let me give you an example. So let's say I want to know, why can birds fly and why can't we not? Right? There's clearly some differences there. I know what they are. The birds have a flying foundation that we lack. Right? There's an innate difference between birds and people, and that is that they have a flying foundation. Now, that's intuitive, right? And it's clearly like there's this like deep essence difference between birds and people, but it doesn't explain anything. It doesn't explain why birds can fly and why we don't. Like, what does it mean to fly? Instead, you have to talk about difficult things like the hollowness of bones and the fact that feathers evolved for thermoregulation and then for flying, right? This like complex stories of explanations. And so I think what moral foundation encourages is intellectually laziness in some sense, right? It gives you a language and then you say, we're done, right? It used to be the case that people thought there were 5 races, right? And they're different. Different races have different skulls, different cultures, live in different continents. We're all fundamentally different, and that's great, right? Because we're all different, and we all have these differences, and they're explained by biology, and that's where each of us kind of belong in our own ways, right? And certainly now, I think we recognize the kind of perniciousness of thinking that we're biologically different races, right? And I think moral foundations is not that bad, but I think it's still making these essentialist arguments for these social constructions.
I get that, but doesn't your theory do that too? Because
It doesn't say that there's any foundations, right? There's no module in the mind. There's no switches in the brain. It's social construction all the way down.
to go with the bird metaphor,
Yeah.
the foundations theory says is there's this thing that makes birds fly. It's a bird foundation instead of talking about the hollow flounce and the wings. But what a dyad does, it just says the reason birds can fly and humans can't is because birds are birds and humans are humans. Doesn't that simplify
No, because
harm or not harm?
so the important thing with scientific explanation is that there's an additional level below it, right? So the points I brought out, there's 3 points, right? Hollowness of bones, right? Having feathers, and maybe like little legs or something like that, right? So yeah, wings, perfect. So right now, so now we furnish an explanation by pointing to 3 more basic domain general principles that all humans have bones, all right, all animals have bones, right? All animals have arms, but now birds have a different set of arms and a different set of bones. Now, the dyad says, look, we all share perceptions of intention, causation, and damage. Liberals care about damage to animals, to the environment. Conservatives care about damage to the church, right, to the powerful. Now, all of a sudden, what we have is an explanation, something that we all agree on, perceptions of harm, but we just perceive it differently, right? We've got to an underlying explanation of what it means to say what purity is. So I think what moral foundations does is it highlights us to moral differences, and that's good. But I think by essentializing those labels, and as a sociologist, I feel like you should be against essentialism, right?
As I said, I don't like how it's measured.
It's not even measurement, right? It's about labels, right? It's about black and white people will never get along. They're different people. There's a black module and a white module, right? And that's why we can never see eye to eye, right? I don't believe in that, and I don't think that sociologists in general believe in that, and I don't think we should believe in that, because there's no biological predestination for race, right? It's a constructed thing. And how we explain race, as a sociologist or psychologist, you explain it with features, right? Heritage, history, culture, right? Those things together make race, just like the things I've highlighted make morality, is what I would say. Yeah?
I understand the difference between your theory and the moral foundation theory. And the thing is, like, based on your theory, you're trying to emphasize on the commonality of people, like, and they all have these 3 components of the dyadic morality. But it still didn't explain why we have different perceptions in terms of what
Yeah, great question. So the question is, what accounts for variations in perceptions of harm, perceptions of intentionality, causation, and vulnerability? So I think I'm kind of like happy that you asked that question, because that suggests that already you kind of right by that these things underlie harm. And I mean, the amazing thing about the mind, life, everything, is that there's turtles all the way down, right? So you can explain things with different perceptions of harm, but now harm is made up of different things. So what underlies different perceptions of those? And so you could get at cultural assumptions about vulnerability, right? The kind of like weakness of cultural institutions or not. The ability to have witchcraft in a culture, right? If you think that scrolling something on a piece of paper and burning it after covering it in blood actually causes things, then you think that that could be immoral, right? So there's assumptions about causation and intentionality and vulnerability all the way down. And then you can be like, well, what causes those assumptions? And so I think that the existence of questions at one lower level of analysis doesn't kind of invalidate the fact that there is that other level of analysis, right? So you can say, right, what causes people to get sick? Cells. Well, what causes cells to act? Well, biochemistry. Well, what causes biochemistry? Well, chemistry. Well, what causes molecules to interact? Well, physics, right? What underlies physics? Atoms, quarks, right? So down and down you go into the rabbit hole. There's always something else below it. And so, of course, there's things below harm, but the important point is that harm is below our moral judgments, I would argue. Should we?
Any other final questions for Kurt?
Yeah, please.
We are talking about generalize the morality judgment to. Can we generalize the morality judgment to non-human objects in terms of being the? We don't apply moral rules to non-human objects. I don't usually think my computer as immoral so I wonder why you only apply these rules to human objects.
So can you apply morality to non-human objects? I think you understand that computers don't have intention. However, if your computer...
But where does this intention come from? Like where does... We talk about the intentional agent makes some damage to a vulnerable agent. And where does this intention come from?
Where do the perceptions come from, or where does the actual intentional capacity of a computer come from? Well, I think it's just intention. I mean, we're talking about already on the very edges of morality, right? So like, let's ground this with like, let's talk about genocide, and then there's like your computer messing up, right? So we're already dealing with like the fringes of morality here. And so the extent to which you see it as at all immoral, your computer messing up, is probably immoral because it deleted some paper that you were working on and you didn't save, right? Or it broke on you in a presentation. So, and I think you perceive some intention because the computer's kind of smart in some ways. It can do math much faster than you can. But yeah, and I'm happy to talk more about.
Sometimes I see my cat enjoying torturing a mouse, but I don't really use the moral judgment to apply to it. I wonder why there is a difference between, like, I'm judging other human beings versus.
So mind perception is perceived along a continuum, and your cat or a computer has less mind than a person. But I'm happy to talk more about cats, computers, and sex robots after the talk. And I'm happy to talk more about the measurement of moral foundations. Yeah, one more question? Yeah?
I think probably person would have been ecstatic about everything you outlined here for the most part.
Okay, I'm not familiar.
He wrote Automotive Signal Maintenance.
Oh, uh-huh.
His sequel was Lila, an inquiry into morals. My friends and I really dug it and had a lot of discussions about it. The book came out like 25 years ago.
Okay.
So I'm old. Well, beyond that, especially, I like how you outlined airline safety. That's something I've looked into. There are 100,000 safe flights in the last decade in this country, but those don't make the news. And it's also why children are allowed to sit on laps. You think, oh, that's not so, yeah, it's still way, way safer, 10 times as safe per mile.
Right.
Or more. Anyhow, thank you for doing that, and I really enjoyed almost everything you said. And I didn't grasp it all. There's a lot there, but I imagine I'm looking forward to reading some of your stuff, like in the New York Times. And do you have some videos out there as well?
There may be some videos. I think if you want, it doesn't go into detail as much about the kind of nitty-gritty of debates, but there's a book called The Mind Club that I co-authored with my advisor, and yeah, so that's available for purchase.
Well, thanks for planting the seed here.
No worries. And thank you for allowing me the opportunity to plug my book. Appreciate that.
One last question.
All right.
So I mean, you're presenting a very different philosophy and model of mind compared to what the majority of moral psychologists have done over the past 20 years. I mean, in your view, what do you think are some of the biggest sources of resistance or inhibitors to adopting this more flexible constructionist view of the mind?
Good question. So what are the inhibitors to accepting a constructionist view of the mind? And I think the answer is essentialism. So when people conceive of differences, they understand those differences as having different essences. It's very hard for us. I mean, children do it at a very young age, right? What makes this cat different than a skunk? There's like a different essence. And in fact, humans have been essentialists since the beginning of time. So we used to think that species were in fact made distinct forever, right? And then an aardvark was always an aardvark, and a chimp was always a chimp, and there would be no way to transcend those essential species boundaries. And then when the theory of evolution came along, people got really upset for many reasons. Not only did it challenge people's view under the divine, but it also suggested that species were not these clear concepts, right? That in fact they just happen to be human constructions that we made when we perceived the world, and that actual animals were very messy and didn't have clear boundaries and so forth. So I think the same is true about our mental states. When you feel an emotion, when you feel a moral judgment, when someone explains to you the sense of purity, you're like, yeah, I get it. And if you say well, those are actually consisting of more basic ingredients that underlie everything, people are hesitant to accept that because things feel different in their minds, and so they think they must be different in their cognition. But I think that's not true.
Well, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.